Hello, everybody. My name is Natalie Dauphinet. I'm a member of Dr. Brooke Breaux's Cognition and Psycholinguistics Research Lab at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. Our lab explores things such as what people say and why they say what they say. And today I'll be presenting our research on Is fake news just a new name for propaganda? For many of us, we became aware of the term fake news during the 2016 election season. During this time, Google searches for the term fake news skyrocketed. According to a Merriam-Webster blog post, the term fake news has been around for approximately 125 years now. However, there's still debate about what exactly the term fake news means and if it's any different in some meaningful way from the term propaganda. There's some evidence to suggest that propaganda is just a particular type of fake news. For example, research by Tandock et al. Found that researchers studying fake news tended to view propaganda in this way. We wondered then the extent to which everyday people think of the terms fake news and propaganda as synonymous. The popularity of memes, such as the one currently being shown, suggests that at least some people think of fake news as just a new name for propaganda. We also wondered whether the way a person defines these terms might depend on their political identification. We had two primary research questions. Are the terms fake news and propaganda associated with similar or distinct meanings? And does the way that a person defines these terms depend on their political identification? We used Amazon's Mechanical Turk to recruit participants. This means that our participants are people on the internet who participated in our research for a small amount of monetary compensation. We collected data from 203 participants, 90 women, and 113 men. The average age of our participants was 36, and they ranged in age from 19 to 72 years old. Participants were first given an informed consent, which was immediately followed by our cover story, which involved minor deception, in which we told participants that we were interested in examining their visual and verbal learning styles. After asking our participants some basic demographic questions, we then asked them to rate 42 news sources, such as CNN, The Huffington Post, Fox News, and InfoWars, that span the political spectrum and varied in terms of journalistic integrity. Participants rated the degree to which they would label each source as real news, fake news, or propaganda. We then asked our participants about the amount of time they devote to news each day. After that, we asked our participants to consider the terms fake news and propaganda and what they mean and how they're similar or different. After that, participants indicated their political identification from far left to far right and told us what they thought this study was about. They then received a debriefing letter to let them know our real reasons for actually conducting this research. And this talk focuses on the results of Step 6 and Step 7. We conducted three types of linguistic analyses to analyze the definitions of fake news and propaganda that people provided us with. We were interested in both evidence of similarity or distinctness and the role that participants' political identification might play. 95% of our participants provided definitions that we could use in our analysis. To look for evidence of similarity or distinctness, we started off with some simple categorizations. One thing that participants did was to be explicit about whether they thought fake news and propaganda were similar or different. A similar explicit example is, they are similar to me. They exist to prove an agenda rather than tell the truth. A different explicit example is, fake news and propaganda are not at all similar. What we found from this categorization is that 18% of participants explicitly indicated that fake news and propaganda were similar, but only 3% of participants explicitly indicated a difference. Then we asked whether being on the left or right side of the political spectrum makes a difference, and our results here indicated no. This suggests that participants tend to view the two terms as similar, regardless of their political identification. Another way in which we categorize these definitions was by determining whether one shared definition was used to describe both fake news and propaganda, or whether two separate definitions were provided. A shared example is they're lying or making things up for views and political agenda, and the separate example is propaganda has an agenda. Fake news is for ad revenue. What we found from this categorization is that 23% of participants used one shared definition, but 72% of participants provided us with two separate definitions. Then we asked whether being on the left or the right side of the political spectrum makes a difference, and here our results indicated yes. Liberals and conservatives produced the same proportion of shared definitions, but liberals produced significantly more separate definitions as compared to conservatives, 80% compared to 61%. This suggests that liberals may have an increased tendency to think of fake news and propaganda as distinct. Our next analysis used the keywords function and wordsmith tools to compare the frequency with which particular words appeared in definitions of fake news as compared to definitions of propaganda. The keywords analysis identified both words that appeared more frequently in definitions of fake news and words that appeared more frequently in definitions of propaganda. We found 10 words that were unique to fake news. These words tended to be closely tied to alternative ways of saying fake news, including words associated with negation, such as false, and synonyms for news, such as facts. We found 27 words unique to propaganda. These words tended to be closely tied to the idea of taking a particular perspective, such as skewed, and words that tap into actions and purpose, such as convince. When political identification was added to this analysis, we found significant differences. Of most interest is the findings that fabricated was a word more often used by liberals in their definitions of fake news. For propaganda, truth and skewed were words more often produced by liberals, but story was used more often by conservatives. Again, this data is suggestive of distinction. Different words are unique depending on the term being defined, and people with different political backgrounds are showing a tendency to use some words in their definitions more than others. That being said, remember that all other words are being used just as often across the two terms and across political identification, which is evidence of similarity. Our next analysis used the linguistic inquiry and word count program, which we also used to compare the frequency with which words appeared in definitions of fake news as compared to definitions of propaganda. However, instead of individual words, Luke uses psychologically relevant categories of words. We have 4 of these categories called summary categories that are the ones that we used for this analysis. The first summary category we'll look at is analytical thinking, which looks at the frequency with which words related to logical thinking and problem solving were produced by participants when defining either fake news or propaganda. This pattern suggests a difference between the definitions, such that definitions of propaganda contained more words associated with analytical thinking than did definitions of fake news. When political identification was added in as a between subjects measure and participants were identified as center or removed from our analysis, the significant effect of definitions maintained. However, there was no significant interaction involving political identification. The next summary category we'll look at is clout. Words related to clout would show evidence of authority or confidence. The frequency with which words related to clout were produced by participants was higher for propaganda as compared to fake news. Again, this is suggesting a distinction between the two terms. When political identification was added in as a between subjects measure and participants who identified as center were removed from the analysis, the significant effect of definition maintained. However, there was no significant interaction. Our next summary category we have is authenticity. Words related to authenticity tend to indicate honesty. The two terms did not differ significantly in terms of their authenticity. Now, here we have some evidence of similarity again. When political identification was added in as a between subjects measure and participants who identified as center were removed from our analysis, it did result in a significant interaction. The interaction was such that definitions for fake news provided by conservatives contained more authentic language as compared to liberals, and the opposite pattern was found between conservatives and liberals for definitions of propaganda. The last summary category is emotional tone. Typically, scores below 50 are going to indicate a negative emotional tone. Our data revealed that our participants' fake news definitions included words that were more negative in tone than our participants' propaganda definitions. This may have had something to do with the use of negation words that we described earlier. And what this finding again suggests to us is a difference between the two definitions tied to these two terms. When political identification was added in as a between subjects measure and participants who identified as center were removed from our analysis, there was a significant main effect of political identification and a significant interaction. The main effect of political identification was such that emotional tone was more positive for participants on the left and more negative for participants on the right, but this difference is best explained by the interaction. Emotional tone in the fake news definitions did not differ across political identification, but emotional tone in the propaganda definitions did. Definitions of propaganda provided by liberal participants were more likely to use words with positive emotional tone than definitions of propaganda provided by conservative participants. So let's recap. Are the terms fake news and propaganda associated with similar or distinct meanings? Our categorization analyses provided some evidence for each, with similar explicit definitions being given more frequently and separate definitions also being given more frequently. Our keyword analyses provided some evidence for distinctness. However, you have to remember that any words that were not unique were by definition equally used across the definitions for both terms. In 3/4 of our LIWC analyses, summary variables yielded differences across definitions. Now let's recap for political identification. Does the way that a person defines these terms depend on their political identification? Our categorization analyses provided evidence for both, however, with only the separate definitions showing differences between political identification. Our keyword analyses provided some unique words for political identification. However, remember that this does mean the rest of the words that were not unique were used equally across political identification. In 2 of our LIWC analyses, summary variables showed differences across definitions, while 2 did not. So to kind of wrap things up, our individual responses did vary widely, and the meanings tied to fake news and propaganda are often overlapping, but at the same time, they also appear to be distinguishable. The meanings can also differ across political identification. So can we conclude? Is fake news just another name for propaganda? Our research results suggest that fake news is not just another name for propaganda. And this is a reminder that the way that we label disinformation is incredibly important, and that if we label it in a particular way, people may perceive the information differently. Our lab is continuing to conduct research to investigate what people think these terms actually mean and how the use of these terms might affect the way that someone judges a news story. We would like to thank Chloe Leger, Taylor Johnson, and Sam Daly for all of their previous contributions to this research project. I'd like to also give a big thank you to everyone today for listening.